My mother-in-law tried to break us up when she found out my husband taking care of the house and cooking after I had a difficult delivery. I always imagined that the birth of my first child would be the most beautiful and emotional experience of my life. I pictured joyous smiles, proud tears, and the overwhelming love of holding my baby for the first time. But nothing could have prepared me for what I went through. The delivery was brutal. Excruciating. My labor lasted for 32 grueling hours. The doctors eventually had to perform an emergency C-section when my baby's heart rate dropped dangerously low. The moment they cut me open, I faded in and out of consciousness, my body trembling violently from the spinal anesthesia. I heard the faintest cry of my baby before the world went black. When I woke up, I was exhausted and barely functioning. My arms were too weak to hold my newborn. I could barely sit up, let alone care for him. My body was a wreck, stitched, sore, and trembling. But worse than the physical pain was the overwhelming guilt. I was his mother. I was supposed to nurture him, hold him, and comfort him. But instead, I was too weak to do anything. I lay in that hospital bed, broken and helpless, while my husband, Daniel, stepped up in every way imaginable. From the moment we brought our son, Leo, home, Daniel became my anchor. While I struggled to recover, unable to walk without wincing or bend without my stitches pulling, he took charge of everything. He changed Leo's diapers. He burped him after feedings. He walked the floors at 2 a.m. when Leo wouldn't settle, whispering gentle lullabies into his tiny ears. He held him against his bare chest for skin-to-skin contact, soothing him when he cried. And when I couldn't even get out of bed, Daniel took care of me too. He brought me warm compresses for my aching muscles. He prepared healing soups to nourish my battered body. He made sure I took my medication on time and gently cleaned my incision site. And when the pain grew unbearable, he simply held me, his arms wrapped around me tightly, as if he could somehow absorb my suffering. I was in awe of him. The man who once burned water when trying to cook pasta was now making full-course meals. He vacuumed, did the laundry, scrubbed the bathrooms, all while caring for our newborn. And through it all, he never once complained. He never acted like he was doing me a favor. He did it because he loved me. Because we were in this together, and I felt immensely grateful, but not everyone did, not his mother. At first, Evelyn, my mother-in-law, was cordial. She came to the hospital, brought flowers, and even held Leo for a few minutes. She smiled and said the right things, but I sensed an undercurrent of disapproval. I brushed it off, thinking I was just being paranoid. But as the weeks passed, her mask slipped. Whenever she came over, she made tiny comments, little daggers disguised as concern. She would watch Daniel rock Leo in his arms and mutter under her breath, "Men these days. Getting soft," or she'd glance at him while he was folding laundry and let out a loud, dramatic sigh. "I don't know how you let him do this much work, Mary." "It's not his job," she would laugh lightly, but her eyes would narrow with disapproval. And then, when Daniel prepared dinner, spending hours in the kitchen so I could rest, she would smirk and say, "I guess you're the wife now, huh?" Her voice was laced with condescension, a cruel mockery. I felt my stomach twist every time, but I bit my tongue. I didn't want to create tension, I didn't want to ruin Leo's relationship with his grandmother, so I smiled tightly, ignoring the sting of her words, but it only grew worse, and then she crossed the line. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. Daniel was in the kitchen, preparing lunch, while I sat on the couch, Leo sleeping soundly in my arms. Evelyn arrived unannounced, as she often did, and waltzed in like she owned the place. She sat across from me, her eyes cold and assessing, watching as Daniel moved around the kitchen with practiced ease. He hummed softly as he diced vegetables, completely unbothered by her presence. After a few minutes of silence, she finally spoke. Her voice was low and biting. "You're making him do everything," she said coolly. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes sharp. "You've turned my son into your maid." I stiffened, my arms instinctively tightening around Leo. I felt the anger rise in my chest, but I kept my voice calm. He's doing what any good husband and father would do, I said, my voice firm but even. And I'm recovering from major surgery, she scoffed, her eyes narrowing with disdain. Recovering, she sneered. You had a baby. Women have been doing it for centuries. You're just being lazy. Her words punched the air from my lungs. My hands trembled slightly as I clutched Leo closer to my chest. But before I could say anything, she leaned forward and hissed, "You're just using this recovery nonsense as an excuse to make Daniel your servant. You're turning him into a woman." I was stunned into silence. My mouth opened, but no words came out. I was shaking with disbelief, barely able to comprehend her malicious cruelty. I was about to snap back when Daniel's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Get out!" Evelyn whipped around, her eyes wide with shock. She hadn't realized Daniel had been listening the entire time. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen, his hands clenched into tight fists. His eyes were blazing with fury, his jaw tight with barely contained rage. "Get out, Emom," he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. Right now, her mouth fell open slightly, her face flushing with indignation. "Daniel." I was just, "No," his voice was firm, unwavering, his eyes never left hers. "You insulted my wife. You insulted me. And you insulted my son's mother." He stalked toward her, his eyes flashing. "You don't get to belittle the woman I love. You don't get to undermine her recovery or her worth." His voice shook with controlled fury. "And if you can't respect my wife, then you're not welcome in our home." Evelyn's face paled, her lips parted, and for once, she had no clever retort. She stared at Daniel, stunned, her eyes wide with disbelief. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and trembling. "Daniel, she's turned you against me," she whispered, her voice quivering with betrayal. "I'm your mother." "No," his voice was cold and final. "Mary is my wife. She is my family. And Leo is my son. They come first. Always." And then, without waiting for her response, he strode to the door, opened it, and pointed outside. "Get out." Her face turned bright red, her eyes flashing with shock and rage, but she didn't argue. She turned on her heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. As the door slammed shut behind Evelyn, the entire house was plunged into an eerie silence. The sound of her heels clacking angrily down the driveway still echoed faintly in the distance, but inside, all I could hear was the rapid pounding of my heart. My hands, still trembling slightly, clutched Leo against my chest. The baby blissfully unaware of the storm that had just passed. I pressed a soft kiss to his forehead, inhaling the sweet scent of his skin, trying to calm the wave of emotion threatening to overwhelm me. Daniel stood by the door for a moment, his hands still clenched into tight fists, his chest rising and falling heavily with each breath. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw remained rigid, as though he were still holding back the fury simmering beneath his skin. And then, slowly, he turned to me. When his eyes met mine, they softened instantly. The rage evaporated, replaced by a tenderness so deep it made my throat tighten. Without saying a word, he walked over and knelt in front of me. He gently brushed aside the loose strands of hair sticking to my damp cheeks and cupped my face in his warm, calloused hands. His eyes, filled with unwavering love and devotion, locked onto mine. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Are you okay?" And just like that, the dam burst. I fell into his arms, sobbing against his shoulder. My whole body shook as the pent-up emotions, the hurt, the stress, the exhaustion, came crashing down all at once. I clung to him, my fingers fisting his shirt as though letting go would break me. And Daniel held me. He wrapped his arms around me tightly, pressing soft kisses to my temple, whispering gentle reassurances into my hair. His hands ran soothingly along my back, steadily grounding me. "I'm here," he murmured over and over again. "I'm right here. You're safe. It's over. I've got you." It took a long time for the sobs to subside into soft sniffles. When I finally pulled back, my eyes were swollen and puffy, but I felt lighter, as if some of the weight crushing my chest had finally lifted. Daniel reached out and gently wiped my tears away with the pads of his thumbs. Then he kissed my forehead, lingering there, his breath warm against my skin. "She won't come back here," he said softly but firmly, his voice dripping with conviction. "Not after today. Not ever if I can help it." Later that evening, after Leo had been fed and rocked to sleep, Daniel and I sat together on the couch. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the baby monitor on the coffee table. I curled into him, my head resting against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. His arm was draped around me, holding me close, his fingers absently stroking my hair. We didn't speak for a long time. We didn't need to. The weight of the day still hung heavily in the air, but the silence was comforting, not heavy. Just the two of us, our hearts in sync, our breaths slow and steady, as if we were finally exhaling after holding it all in for far too long. After a while, Daniel pressed a kiss to the top of my head and whispered softly, "You're amazing, you know that?" I blinked, startled by his words. I tilted my head slightly, looking up at him. "What?" I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. His gaze was tender, his expression full of adoration. "You carried our son for 9 months, he said softly, his fingers tracing slow, lazy circles along my arm. "You went through hell during delivery. You're still recovering, and you're still the most incredible mother and wife I could ever hope for." I felt tears sting my eyes again, but this time, they weren't from sadness. They were from love. From gratitude. "And nothing," he added, his voice firm with certainty, "nothing is going to change the way I feel about you. Not my mother. Not anyone," and in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that he meant it. That no one, not even Evelyn, could come between us. In the days that followed, Evelyn tried to retaliate. She called Daniel repeatedly, leaving angry voicemails. At first, she played the victim, sobbing into the phone. "How could you do this to your own mother?" She demanded that Daniel apologize. She claimed that I had turned him against her, that I was manipulative and controlling. When Daniel refused to answer, she switched tactics. She sent guilt-ridden texts, telling him how heartbroken she was, how she was just trying to help. She blamed me, insisting that I was the reason she was being cast out, but Daniel didn't budge. He blocked her number. When she showed up at the house once again, he refused to open the door. And when she tried to turn his family against him, he made it clear, "If you support my mother in disrespecting my wife, I will cut you out too." His unwavering loyalty left no room for doubt. We made our boundaries crystal clear. Daniel changed the locks to the house, ensuring Evelyn would never enter without permission. We made the decision to limit contact with her indefinitely. No more drop-ins. No more passive-aggressive visits. We were a family of 3 now, Daniel, Leo, and me. And no one else mattered. The most remarkable thing was how freeing it felt. Without Evelyn's constant criticism, our home felt lighter, brighter. Daniel and I could breathe again, without the looming cloud of her disapproval. When my parents found out what had happened, they were furious. My mother, normally gentle and soft-spoken, was livid. She came over the next day with a homemade casserole and sat by my side, stroking my hair while I held Leo in my arms. She whispered softly, "I'm proud of you, Mary. For standing tall. For being strong. And for raising my grandson in a home full of love, not bitterness." Her words soothed the ache left behind by Evelyn's cruelty. I wasn't alone. I had support, love, and protection, both from my husband and from my own family. As time passed, Evelyn's bitterness became her own downfall. She alienated Daniel's extended family with her vindictive lies. No one wanted to hear her self-pitying rants. She was left isolated and bitter, her cruelty having driven away the son she once adored. Her calls and texts dwindled. Eventually, she stopped trying altogether. And Daniel? He never wavered. He remained by my side, unshakable and devoted, proving over and over again that his love for me was unbreakable. Months passed, and with each day, my body grew stronger. I no longer needed Daniel to do everything. but he still did so much. Because that's the man he was. Because he loved me. And when I looked at him, holding Leo in his arms, singing softly to our son, I knew we had been forged in fire, and we had emerged stronger. Unbreakable. Together.